So welcome everyone to our eighth and final Policy Brown Bag series hosted by the Educational Leadership Policy Program here in the College of Ed at Texas Tech. My name is Jacob Kirksey. I'm an assistant professor, and I'm very happy to introduce our speaker for today, who's going to talk to us about pre-K through third alignment. I'm not saying that topic as accurately and eloquently as you will, Michael, but prior to turning it over to our speaker, I want to give Professor Little a nice introduction. So Michael Little is an assistant professor in the College of Education at North Carolina State University. Prior to joining the faculty at NC State, Dr. Little was a researcher at the American Institutes for Research, or AIR. While at AIR, he worked on a range of studies for federal and state governments and foundations. Dr. Little studies early childhood and early grade education policy, which you will hear a lot about today. His work aims to achieve the goal of equity in early childhood education so that all children begin their educational careers on solid ground. To achieve this goal, he conducts research that helps us to understand how to build a coherent and aligned system of early education that seamlessly bridges the pre-K and early elementary grades. This area of research, which he'll talk about today, is pre-K through third, or P-3 education research. Prior to turning it over to Professor Little, I just want to highlight some of his accomplishments. Most recently, he was awarded the prestigious AERA research grant for his research. He was also, while in graduate school, selected to participate in the David L. Clark Graduate Research Seminar, which those in educational leadership also know very well. And then finally, his work has appeared in some of the top education and policy journals, including Educational Researcher, AERA Open, and Early Childhood Research Quarterly. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Little.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm very glad to be here. I know this is, oh, now people are coming in. I'm just going to admit a couple people. There we go. I'm happy to be here, and I am thankful for you all for being here at the end of the semester. I know this is a very chaotic time. After I get off this call, I'm going to go back to grading some papers myself. So I sincerely appreciate your time today. So let me go ahead and share my web browser, and then I will launch these slides. And Jacob, if someone else comes in, are you still a co-host and you can admit them, or do I need to?
Yeah, I can admit them for you.
Okay, awesome. All right, so my talk today is entitled Delivering on the Promise of Pre-K through Third Alignment. And as Jacob's introduction said, I'm really trying to build that brand as a concept that people need to focus on. And so my talk today is it's a reflection on a number of different things I've worked on over the past 5 or 6 years with respect to this topic. So here's the overview of what I'm going to do. First, I want to tell you a little bit about just what brought me to focus on this in my own research. And then I'm going to move from kind of the personal to the academic research. And so what are some of the key challenges that have been brought forth in the early childhood education literature that motivate the work? I'm then going to introduce P3 alignment as one potential solution to some of these critical challenges. And then once I outline the concept of P3 alignment, I'm going to talk about the specific case of school-based pre-K and the extent to which putting pre-K into elementary school buildings might facilitate some aspects of P3 alignment. And I'm going to do so through highlighting a specific study that was a spinoff from my dissertation, which examines the differences in school-based versus non-school-based pre-K. And then I'll conclude with some future directions for research where I'm going in the future, and I hope others do too, as well as some overall lessons that I've learned through engaging in this work. So to begin with what kind of just brings me to this work generally, at the beginning of my undergraduate career, I was a literacy coach with the AmeriCorps for a year, and I was working in pre-K and kindergarten classrooms in Durham, North Carolina. And it was through that experience, seeing firsthand the really stark and drastic differences that in readiness skills that kids bring with them at the beginning of their educational careers struck me as just really unjust and something that needed to be addressed, particularly because in our educational system, it's similar to, you could think of it as the beginning of a race, and we're basically setting kids on a trajectory with different starting lines. And then once kids enter the K-12 educational system, we know that those inequalities often persist and sometimes can even grow. And so that's what kind of solidified for me a desire to focus on those earliest years and setting up a strong foundation for an equitable start. And so turning from kind of what brought me to this space to the research is we have really robust evidence that pre-K can boost school readiness and later life outcomes. You're seeing the reality of these decades of research as evidenced by the State of the Union address a week ago at this point, where the Biden administration is proposing through the American Families Plan, universal pre-K for 3- and 4-year-olds, as well as significant funding to support parents' ability to pay for childcare. We have really strong evidence on the effectiveness of pre-K programs from early model programs. And so these are little experiments that happened in the 60s and 70s. The most famous among them are the Perry Preschool Project in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and in my own backyard, the Carolina Abecedarian Study in Chapel Hill at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute. These are the most exciting findings that people tend to latch onto because they've been able to follow these participants into later life, and they're showing really interesting kind of downstream effects like lower incarceration rates, better health outcomes, less likelihood to have to use like public assistance resources and things like that. In addition to these early model programs, there's also strong evidence on the effectiveness of scaled up programs. The original and most notable is the federal Head Start program, which was part of Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty programs. And we have some really strong evidence through both intergenerational studies, since the program's been around for so long, as well as sibling studies that compare within families, siblings that attended Head Start and did not attend Head Start. And then last, there's emerging evidence on the effectiveness of state and local pre-K programs. So here I'm talking about like North Carolina's pre-K program, or a state or a municipal program in like Austin, Texas, for example, has a municipal program. And the evidence here is a little bit less longitudinal. We're starting to see some impacts of programs through middle school, but there's just not enough time since a lot of these programs have become scaled up across states to evaluate them. But there's mixed results, but a lot of progress scaled up state pre-K programs can provide positive and sustained impacts. But then notice the title of the slide is Pre-K Can Boost School Readiness Outcomes. So now I'm going to switch to a couple of the critical challenges that we face in the early childhood education sphere. The first is this idea of pre-K fade out, pre-K convergence. Some people say pre-K catch up, but basically what it means is it's this relationship that in evaluations of many scaled up pre-K programs, the initial benefits for kids often dissipate rapidly once they leave pre-K. And so in this graph, this is a graphic from a meta-analysis by Drew Bailey and colleagues. And I think it summarizes, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's a pretty robust amount of evaluations of pre-K programs. And so on the vertical axis, they plot the effect size on cognitive outcomes at the end of the pre-K program. And then on the horizontal axis, it's the years since the end of the program. And so at year 0, so that's the very end of pre-K, you see that kids get a really good boost, a 0.23 standard deviation boost in terms of their cognitive scores. However, if you just go out 1 year, so this would be at the end of kindergarten, the magnitude of the benefits of pre-K have more than halved to only a 1/10 of a standard deviation. And then if you look out 2 to 4 years after pre-K, the impacts are statistically indistinguishable from 0, as denoted by that box being not shaded in. And so you see this really rapid decline a lot of times with scaled up programs. Now I should note there's a lot of variation. Some programs show dramatic fade out, like the Tennessee pre-K program, whereas other states programs do not show fade out. So in North Carolina, for example, some folks at Duke have evaluated the pre-K program and found sustained impacts through middle school. So there is a lot of variability, but this is a general trend based on a meta-analysis of pre-K impact studies. One of the other critical challenges is that not all pre-K programs are equally effective. There's a lot of variability in terms of quality. And so in this graphic, this plots another meta-analysis, this one by Catherine Magnuson and colleagues. And again, on the vertical axis, they plot the average effect size of the evaluation. But this time on the horizontal axis, it's the year in which the evaluation took place, or the year in which the students in the evaluation were assessed, rather. And so, and the bubbles just denote kind of the size of the evaluation. And you'll notice that some of the largest impact programs are those at the have the highest impact. So the Perry and Abecedarian studies, they're these little model programs, but they had really strong impacts. However, over time, as more scaled up programs have been brought forth, the impacts tend to be a little bit closer to zero on average. And you can also see that the average effect size has gone down over time, as indicated by the line of best fit. And there's debate about what's really causing this. Some people think that just you're getting more scaled up programs and it's hard to scale quality. And then alternative explanations are that the counterfactual condition has just improved over time for pre-K attenders. So in the 60s, our kind of social safety net was not quite as robust as it is today. And so the difference between a kid attending pre-K and staying at home that's less of a stark difference today than it was, decades ago. And so these are kind of the two critical challenges that animate a lot of work in this field: the rapid fade out of pre-K effects, and then also the vast variability in terms of quality. And I should also note, it's not just variability in quality between things like Abecedarian and Head Start. Even if you look within Head Start, individual centers are going to vary dramatically in terms of their effectiveness, which is not surprising. It's something we see. There's a lot of variability in K-12 schools, for example. And so in response to some of these challenges, there's been a movement growing that focuses on building a coherent and an aligned system of early education. And it really positions kind of kindergarten at the nexus of the early childhood and K-12 spheres. And the intention is simply to build a coherent and aligned system that sequentially builds on one another to try to that begins with a high quality scaled up pre-K program, and then it mitigates fade out by ensuring that learning is built upon one another in a coherent way. So this quote from Susan Furman, who wrote a book on designing coherent education policy, just underpins a lot of my thinking here, which is just that coherent education policies need to be congruent, to send the same messages, and to avoid contradictions. And because pre-K is often governed in like departments of health and human services, and K-12 is in departments of public instruction and education, you often get a lot of mixed policy signals. And so there's a lot of redundancy and incoherence. And through this movement of P3 alignment, we're seeking to kind of bring coherence and to avoid these contradictions. And one of the real leaders in this space who's been kind of an inspiration for me is Christy Cowers, and she directs the National P3 Center, which is housed at the University of Colorado, Denver. And she's just truly a leader in this space. And she's developed a framework of P3 alignment. This is a 8-part conceptual framework that she's revised over the past decade. And I'll just quickly go over these different elements because I haven't thought of a way to improve on this, and I can't think of another bucket. I feel like this is truly a good comprehensive overview of what we mean when we talk about P3 alignment. So the first is cross-sector work. This is related to what I was just saying about how pre-K and K-12 are often housed in different governing agencies. And so it's getting those folks to talk to one another and try to coordinate policies and avoid redundancies. The second bucket is administrator effectiveness. As we'll talk about, it's increasingly common that pre-K programs are located within elementary school buildings. And so we need to develop the competencies of elementary school principals, district administrators to understand the value and appropriate pedagogical practices for the early grade continuum. Relatedly, teacher effectiveness. What good teaching looks like in the P3 grade span is different than what good teaching looks like in the higher grades. There's different pedagogical norms, and we need to try to think of this early childhood space as a unique area of the educational continuum. Relatedly, the tools that teachers use. To what extent are standards, curricula, and assessment, this kind of instructional guidance system, aligned with both one another within grades as well as vertically across grades? And then in terms of the learning environment, this is what I've been kind of alluding to with that early childhood is a unique place. There's more focus on child-initiated activities and more kind of pedagogically progressive practices. In terms of data-driven improvement, are teachers provided with evidence and data that it can validly give them signals about where kids are? Do data systems link pre-K and kindergarten so that formative assessment data, for example, can be transferred seamlessly between grades so that teachers can make early quick snapshots of kids' readiness so they can individualize instruction? Also, family engagement. Family engagement is a core part of early childhood, and then it kind of falls off when you get to K-12. And so the idea is to try to pull up some of that family engagement into the early grades, because recognizing that families and caregivers are children's most prominent teacher during that time. And then last is continuity and pathways. And so this can mean a number of things, but it can often we think about things like transition practices, things that are done prior to kids entering school to help make that transition easier. But it can also be things like student assignment policies. Oftentimes, kids might attend pre-K in an elementary school, but then not be zoned for that elementary school for the next grade. And so trying to think through how to assign kids in ways that start forging those connections so that there's continuity and a coherent pathway. So now I'm going to transition into a specific way we might achieve some of these features of P3 alignment. And I don't think it's a panacea or a cure-all, but from a policy perspective, I've been interested in placing pre-K in schools because while what the people are doing in the building matters a lot, where we put programs as we continue to scale up pre-K, it is a very policy amenable thing, right? That's something that's malleable and policymakers can make decisions on. And so for the last few years, I've been exploring this phenomenon. And so just as a little bit of background, pre-K programs, even within a state program like North Carolina's pre-K program, the same classroom, an NC pre-K certified classroom can be located either in an elementary school or in a standalone center like a, Happy Apples daycare center, something like that. And so just to give you a little context, that we're talking about just differences in location, not in the underlying program. And there's a number of reasons to think that putting pre-K into schools might facilitate features of P3 alignment. First is that it gets people in the same building so they can talk to one another. You can have a principal facilitate pre-K teachers and kindergarten teachers having vertical PLC meetings, for example. And that's something that really would be difficult to do when the pre-K center is a couple miles down the road. Another reason why we think, or I think school-based pre-K might facilitate P3 alignment is from the child's perspective. So by spending a year, their pre-K year in an elementary school building, they might acquire the approaches to learning and just kind of learning what school is to make that transition into kindergarten more seamless, because we do know that the transition to kindergarten is really, really challenging for students. And so I'm going to provide you all with just a little bit of background on and context on the extent to which pre-K is actually already a part of elementary schools. And so this is some in-process data analysis that I'm doing using the NCES Common Core of data. So it's just some basic descriptive stats. I apologize, it's just showing up a little blurry. But here I'm plotting the proportion of elementary schools in the United States that have a pre-K grade. And now it's important to distinguish when I say grade, what that means can vary a lot. So it could be that there's an elementary school with 5 students in a pre-K classroom that are being served through like early intervention, special education kind of funding, and not a full 20-person pre-K classroom. But you can see that there's been a steady increase in the proportion of elementary schools with a pre-K grade. It currently sits at about 58% of elementary schools in the United States. Now here I take a look at student enrollment. So this is kind of trying to disentangle that difference between a grade and how many students are actually in that grade. And here I relate pre-K enrollment, student enrollment, as a proportion of kindergarten enrollment, the adjacent grade, which is a more universal grade. And you'll see again a steady increase in student enrollment, but it is a little bit lower in terms of overall proportion. In the 2018-19 academic year, student enrollment in pre-K in public elementary schools as a proportion of kindergarten enrollment was 42%. So we're not quite at 50%, but we're approaching that. And so just to summarize this context, pre-K is steadily becoming a feature of public elementary schools in the United States. And then didn't have graphics that show this, but in some of the supplementary analysis that I've been doing here, I'm finding that the schools with pre-K programs tend to serve more low-income students and students in non-suburban areas. And this makes sense because many of our publicly funded pre-K programs are not universal, and they're means tested, and they're meant to target these specific subpopulations. And so it makes sense that they tend to be located in those areas. So now I'm going to transition into a specific study that I did as part of my dissertation. And this is where I'm looking at differences in school-based versus center-based pre-K. And this study has 3 primary research questions. First, do students who attend school-based pre-K have larger and more persistent early learning skills than students who attend center-based pre-K? Then I ask, what are the practical on-the-ground realities of locating pre-K programs in elementary schools? And then finally, to what extent can this co-location facilitate collaboration and vertical alignment? This study is a convergent parallel mixed methods study. So that just means that the quantitative and qualitative data were collected in tandem, so at the same time. And then once I analyzed both sets of data, I compared and related them to one another to understand how that enhanced my interpretation of the overall research questions. In terms of the quantitative analysis, I used data from the early childhood longitudinal study, the more recent kindergarten cohort, and my outcome measures of interest included math and reading achievement, 2 measures of executive function, and a range of teacher-rated social emotional skills. I used ordinary least squares regression with entropy weights and state fixed effects. And so one of the real benefits of the early childhood longitudinal study and others like other NCES supported surveys is that they include really robust sets of control variables. And it allows us to use kind of these more advanced correlational designs to estimate causal effects relative to administrative data where you have just a small set of kind of crude background characteristics. However, despite that exciting setup, spoiler alert, I found absolutely no differences in student outcomes between school-based pre-K attenders and non-school-based pre-K attenders. And these estimates were pretty precisely estimated at 0. And I was really initially perplexed by this, even though my design was parallel. I got to most of the quantitative analysis first. I was like, oh gosh, what is happening? But it was through the qualitative analysis that I was really able to understand and generate some plausible hypotheses for why I'm seeing these null effects. And so in terms of my qualitative approach, I used semi-structured interviews with 44 different participants. These participants came from pre-K centers, so standalone pre-K centers, teachers and administrators, school-based pre-K programs, so pre-K teachers, K-3 teachers and administrators. And then I also conducted a couple of kind of contextual big picture interviews with state and county level program administrators, both in the Department of Education as well as Health and Human Services, where the pre-K program resides. And here I just summarize some of the key thematic benefits and challenges that emerged from the qualitative analysis. So first, in terms of the benefits, perceived benefits by these respondents, the first is that the normalization of school for students and the ease of transition. So that idea of students just being in the school building, learning how to walk down the hall, what it's like to go into the cafeteria, all of those things help make that transition easier for kids. There's also superior resources. In an elementary school, you have an art room, a library, a playground, all of these different things, media center that the pre-K program can use. And when you think about a standalone kind of small childcare center, they often don't have that level of resources at their disposal. And then last, and I'll delve into this a little bit later, is there are opportunities for collaboration and alignment. And the key word there is opportunities. It's certainly not assured. Now, in terms of some of the difficulties or challenges associated with school-based pre-K, I often heard reports of teacher isolation. So it's often the case that a single pre-K classroom might be located in an elementary school, or maybe two. And so teachers really struggled with not having a peer network, whereas in a large child development center, for example, you might have four-year-old classes, and the teachers have a networking community, and kind of the whole ethos of the center is focused on early childhood versus being kind of the single classroom in the school focused on that. There also is a risk of developmentally inappropriate instruction in these settings. I heard reports of the so-called accountability pushdown and administrators pressuring pre-K and kindergarten teachers to say, you know what, we got to get ready for the third grade test scores, and I need you to focus on this, this, and this, and I need you to do it in this way. And oftentimes what they were being asked to do did not conform with the early learning standards and just general best practices related to the concept of developmentally appropriate practice. And there's also a challenge of mixed policy signals and regulations, and this stems from the different governing agencies. A really kind of minute example is a principal talking about how when there was a snow day, they had two different systems for alerting parents in the K-5 grades versus the pre-K grade, and just some bureaucratic challenges, different regulations for, like the height of tables in the cafeteria and things like that were challenging because these systems aren't unitary. And so when I was looking across the different schools that were included in my study, I found that there was a lot of variability between them. And this is kind of the key to understanding, I think, why I've observed null results quantitatively. Some schools bought into it. They valued the pre-K program. They engaged in a lot of features of P-3 alignment. Other schools, it was like they weren't even there. And so these are some quotes from a school that really engaged in the P-3 alignment work. So a pre-K teacher said, for example, yes, I feel like I'm a part of this school. We conduct vertical planning PLCs where pre-K and kindergarten teachers plan our instruction around common themes. A kindergarten teacher said, I stop by and have lunch with the pre-K classroom when I can. They will be my kids next year. And then this is in contrast to another common phenomenon, which was where the pre-K program was not valued. Here, a principal said, we barely interact with them. They're all the way down at the end of the kindergarten hall. The pre-K and kindergarten teachers do not interact with one another. They aren't really a part of the elementary school. And this kind of illustrates two of the extremes, but there was significant variability here between the extent to which pre-K was integrated into the elementary school. And when I tried to explore, what kind of explained some of these differences, I found that leadership was really key in explaining school-to-school variation in P-3 alignment. Elementary school principals often set the tone for the extent to which teachers bought into and valued the pre-K program. And they also set up the concrete structures and organizational routines that could either include or not include the pre-K program. This could range from like those vertical PLC meetings to even including the pre-K classroom in school-wide assemblies and various programmatic initiatives at the school level. And so there's a couple of limitations and just opportunities associated with this specific study before I go into some broader lessons learned. First, this was the qualitative portion came from a single state context in North Carolina. There's also a lack of real concordance between the qualitative and quantitative data. I'm looking at a national sample quantitatively, and then in North Carolina qualitatively. You know, if I had quantitative data in North Carolina, I might have seen different results. And so I think there's a lot of room for folks to follow up and look at these relationships in different contexts. Also, this ultimately still is a correlational quantitative analysis. I'm not able to say with confidence that these are causal relationships. Also, I'm the sole investigator. Since this was a part of my dissertation, that was by necessity, but it can have implications for my interpretations, particularly on the qualitative side. And then last, something that I really kind of regret looking back on this study is that I didn't really include the perspectives of parents and children. And I think that that matters a lot. Why do parents value different settings over the other? How do children feel about being in these different settings? And so I think there's a lot of room for future research and including a broader range of informants. So now I'm going to transition and talk a little bit about some future directions and lessons that I'm learning through engaging in this work. In terms of future directions, I feel like there's two really big buckets of where this work needs to go next. First, we need to develop better measures of P3 alignment. Going back to that framework by Christy Cowers, there's a lot of different ways you can engage in this work, from data systems to governance to instructional tools to transition practices. And so I think that we need to develop some robust measures of the different facets of P3 alignment. And if we had that, for example, say in the ECLSK data, I had a composite measure of the extent to which schools engaged in P3 alignment. If I interacted that with my pre-K attendance variable, I'd be willing to bet that the stronger P3 alignment schools, I would have observed persistent effects in those settings, or at least I would hypothesize that that would be the relationship. And then also, I think that we need to really focus on principles. Principles seem to be key in facilitating the acceptance and integration and presence of P3 alignment activities. Why is it that some principles support pre-K and others do not? How can we in principal preparation programs better support kind of recognition and understanding of premises of P3 alignment, child development, and developmentally appropriate practice? And you'll also notice that some of these things are being taken up by organizations such as the National Association of Elementary School Principals has developed a rubric and competencies related to P3 alignment, and they also run some leadership academies and professional development opportunities for principals in this space. And then I just wanted to conclude with some lessons that I'm learning through kind of thinking about nothing other than this topic for the last, I guess, 6 years at this point. So P3 alignment it's more than just the structures and systems. So it's more than getting an off-the-shelf curricular program that is seamless from pre-K to kindergarten through to third grade. It's about ideas and beliefs and culture. You have to have buy-in from the different people, because ultimately it's about relationships and bridging divides. And so you've got to have buy-in before you get to all that other stuff. P3 alignment is a journey, it's not a destination. I don't think that there is a perfect P3 aligned school and system. It's going to vary by the populations of students. It's going to vary by kind of the readiness levels of students and where different districts are and what their arrangements are, how they've designed their pre-K systems. So it's really a mindset, and it's a continual desire to try to think critically about how you can reduce redundancies and increase coherence. And then last, P3 alignment requires leadership and sustained support. this is really a comprehensive reform strategy. I think about it, it's honestly very similar to the work in Chicago that Breich and colleagues did with their famous book, Organizing Schools for Improvement, where this work takes a lot of people and leadership is really key. You hear stories about districts that have moved really well in the direction of advancing P-3 alignment initiatives. And then the superintendent turns over that this was like their pet project and everything kind of falls apart. So it really is a comprehensive reform strategy that requires a lot of people buying into it. And then, and so just to conclude, I'm just going back to where I started. I think that my goal was to kind of convince you that pre-K is promising and has a lot of potential. But for us to deliver on its success, we have to kind of follow and build the steps coherently and sequentially so that we can deliver on that promise, sustain early learning gains, and ultimately support kids throughout their educational careers. And I should also acknowledge that this research, a lot of the research at least presented here, stems from work I did on the IES Early Learning Network, which was funded by the US Department of Education to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I look forward to your questions both now, but also if you ever want to follow up and email me, please do so. You can also follow me on Twitter, but I'm looking forward to hearing what you think. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was very interesting. I'm biased because some of our work overlaps a little bit, but yeah, so everyone, now is time for questions. If you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask live.
So I can just start by looking at, I see that something was in the chat from about 20 minutes ago, but so for the 2018-19 data, did pre-K enrollment include students that were in a private preschool environment? No, so this is only, so the CCD data are pretty messy and quite frankly, probably unreliable. I did cross-check it with alternative sources like NEAR and the Office of Civil Rights data collection, but this is only districts reporting on pre-K programs that they have in their public elementary schools. But I will say, there is a possible setup where you can have a private paying child in a public pre-K classroom in a public elementary school. So that is possible, and some districts might be counting those students. And so I've got some really challenging reviews from this. This is actually from a manuscript that's in review right now, but that's one of the key things that the reviewers don't like, is that you don't know what the underlying program is. You just know that they're in the elementary school in a pre-K age-based grade. So it's a limited and crude proxy, but it's the best we can do right now.
Is it okay if I ask a follow-up on that?
Sure.
Cool. So I think the slide before that one, you were showing the kind of deflation of impact over time as you got away from the treatment. Is that in any way potentially open to being, like, it's not comparing the impact to students that didn't get the treatment, right? It's just looking at, so what I think the thing I'm really kind of curious about, I guess, is it possible that an influx of families with means paying to send their kid to private preschool, so they're not they're getting the treatment, but they're not in the data set in the same way, could in any way deflate the impact of pre-K when you look at them in like a comparative way? Because it looks like you've got all these students coming in that didn't get pre-K, when in reality, they may have even gotten higher quality experiences, and they're now sitting in a public kindergarten, first, second grade classroom. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think there's a couple of things there. So one is the kind of like the shifting counterfactual, and that what we're comparing against has changed a lot over time, and it's often very different if you look evaluation to evaluation. Though I mean these. So Drew Bailey, the things that would meet his inclusion criteria for a meta-analysis are all like, you know, either experimental or like robust quasi-experimental design. So theoretically, they should be apples to apples comparisons. But I do think that the other thing that you might be alluding to, and correct me if I'm not interpreting this right, is that you've got kids who attended the public pre-K program going into elementary school with kids that were in the counterfactual that went to private programs. And so just the distance between them is different. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that these studies should have adjusted for that by dealing with those types of selection issues. But I also think it raises important questions about one of the key hypotheses for how to overcome pre-K fade out, and honestly, it's what underlies the whole concept of P3 alignment, is that of the sustaining environments hypothesis, just that what happens next needs to be really strong, because kids that attend public pre-K programs, particularly Head Start, often go on to attend lower quality schools. They have teachers that have lower value added scores. And so you're not kind of getting that richer educational experience immediately subsequently, where you've got more effective and highly qualified teachers in these areas where fewer kids actually are attending pre-K. And so maybe that's what's driving some of that convergence as well. And then the last thing that just comes to mind that you mentioned is, it made me think about peer effects. And there's a little bit of research here, but not much. I think there's a lot of room for people to better understand the composition of classrooms that kids experience once they leave pre-K. Unfortunately, we're really limited with that, with at least data sets like the ECLSK that only include a handful of kids in each classroom in the sample. But administrative data might help answer that as well. So I hope that helps.
That's great, thank you.
Hey there. Thank you so much for that great presentation. Very informative. And I was wondering, as far as a lot of my interest and work is in working with students with disabilities. And so obviously, I think, we're learning even more about folks with disabilities as they're and the impact of early intervention. We've done a little bit of work here in Georgia with the early intervention programs, Babies Can't Wait, things like that, and some of the preschool, pre-K, all of that. What are you seeing, and what do you think as far as the impact when it comes to sustaining that, and the progress that they're making within these programs? And did you see much deviation when it came to, or differences when it came to folks with disabilities compared to those without disabilities that would make a difference in the way we do our work?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Candidly, in the specific quantitative analysis that I did not look at a specific subgroup of students with an IEP, but I think that's a very interesting question, and one that I should follow up on for sure. But there's just a couple things related to what you said, even though I don't have a great response, because that wasn't really focusing on special education as a subgroup, wasn't really a focus of this specific work. But there are a couple things that I'd like to say. One is that P3 alignment, sometimes people like to pit it against birth through third, or birth through age 3, or P through 8. And I don't think that, even though I focus on P3, that doesn't mean B3 doesn't matter, and it doesn't mean B3 shouldn't integrate seamlessly into P3. We need conception to adulthood. We need support everywhere, and it needs to be a totally continuous system. I just happen to focus on this area and want to make this part of the continuum the best it can be. So that's kind of one point. We've got to have that birth through third element as well. The other thing that I think is really interesting is understanding how special ed can play into the sustainment of pre-K effects. One of these alternative hypotheses, I talked about the sustaining environments. Another is what's called the foot in the door hypothesis, and it's that by getting pre-K, you're able to identify and get special education services at a developmentally sensitive time. Whereas if you didn't have that experience, it might be kindergarten or first grade or second grade before you get that. And in the kind of developmental window is a little bit less open at that time. And so the impacts might not be so great. And so some folks are starting to think about, if you attend pre-K and then you get identified for special education, does that kind of pull you into the services when you need them? And then maybe that's what's generating these really astounding later life positive outcomes. Because we're obviously seeing fade out in terms of test scores and cognitive outcomes. So what is the kind of that secret sauce that is happening that is being sustained later in life? Because clearly our measures aren't capturing that at present.
That is so helpful. Have you done much work with Dr. Karen Erickson over at UNC Chapel Hill? And she's the director of the Literacy and Disability Studies Center in the School of Medicine. I'm doing a project with her right now through the CDC, and we're talking about some similar things. So yeah, we can reach out later. But have you worked with her at all?
I haven't, but thank you for the recommendation. It's
Absolutely.
Interesting that she's working, and so she's in the School of Medicine. That's
School of Medicine. That's right. Yes. So very cool. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you. So another question just came in the chat. I'll read it. Do you feel that our educational system will eventually move in the direction of pre-K being mandatory, essentially expanding the idea that public school is a child's right? If so, does this send a negative message to parents that they're not capable of educating their children? That's a very interesting question. It's actually kind of how I framed. So that's the CCD data, looking at the growth in school-based pre-K. The introduction of that manuscript, I actually frame it in this way of the system, is the system extending downward. And I talk about how the same thing happened in the 80s with kindergarten. Kindergarten is a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, in some states, it's still optional and half day. Whereas, in North Carolina, for example, it is universal, full day, but I still believe it's not compulsory. And so there's a lot of variability, but I don't know. I think that there are some movements to definitely move in this direction. I mean, you can see from the Biden administration proposal in New Mexico, actually, they have a whole Office of Early Childhood Education. They're a very unique state from a governance perspective. And I believe that there is a bill to pass a state constitutional amendment, because many states' rights to public education are codified in their state constitutions. And so I think that you might see some states revising their constitutions to begin pre-K at that time. But your second question is there are a lot of politics as you start to move into early childhood education. You're running up against a lot of norms and traditions, and I would say I think that debate is going to continue. I personally don't think it sends a message. I think that it responds to practical realities of what families face today. Women are continually increasing rates of labor force participation. There's practical needs to have safe and enriching spaces for children to grow. And for many families, it's simply not an option to to have one parent stay at home and take care of the child. And I guess I haven't thought deeply about what those messages are. I can certainly see how it could be perceived in that way, but I see it as support for just the realities of the world we live in today. But I think it would be quite a while before it's a mandatory grade. I don't think we're going to be there anytime soon. We're still just trying to get access for optional.
Michael, I have a question, so I'm selfishly going to butt in and ask, Could you talk about the role of the academization of kindergarten and how that has played a factor both in your historical sort of review of what we've seen about the effects of pre-K? You know, I'm thinking of that chart that you showed with the diminishing effects, but then also how you think that factors into your research and if at all it plays into your future lines of inquiry.
Yeah. Yeah. So I actually have thought a lot about this. There's this famous paper that Daphne Bassick wrote at University of Virginia a few years ago and some colleagues called "Is Kindergarten the New First Grade?" And she compares two versions of the ECLSK and documents a really stark increase in kindergartens using whole group instruction, a lot of academic focus, less time on free play centers, things like that. And it raised a lot of red flags and discussion and media reports about how childhood is kind of being corrupted and in the push down. And often this is framed as a response to No Child Left Behind and subsequent accountability pressures. These just things have been trickling down. How that intersects with my own work is multiple ways. One is that I am very cautious about advocating. Well, first of all, I'm cautious about advocating for anything because I like to think of myself as an evidence-based person, but I think that there's really good reasons to think that putting pre-K into schools might help facilitate P3 alignment. At the same time, I recognize that by bringing these two worlds closer together in the same building, we're opening up the door for risk of push down and an overly academic focus. And that's why I think we need to really work on principles because they're kind of they're the buffer there that can either make it or break it. I also do think that, and I'm guilty of this in the way that I think I framed this in the discussion, but developmentally appropriate practice and academic instruction are often pitted against one another, and it doesn't have to be that way. It can be a false dichotomy. I think it's a false dichotomy, to be honest. You can teach, pre-K kids can learn math, and learning math in pre-K is good for kids. It just needs to be done in the right way. You know, you can have kids running around the classroom and jumping up and down and counting. They don't have to be sitting at a desk with a worksheet to learn kind of early academic skills. But I do wonder, now the last kind of thing I would say is relating this to fade out. I question if by focusing more on academic instruction, we might be pushing out the things that lead to the long-term benefits of pre-K. Like, does learning how to count earlier lead to people being less likely to be incarcerated? Probably not. It might be like, what are the social interactions and self-regulation and these kind of non-academic skills that kids are developing in pre-K? Those I think are probably the skills that continue to build and lead to better educational outcomes and these later life outcomes. So I do kind of sometimes worry that we shouldn't shift too far from what the early model pre-K programs were, because we know that those are generating these really robust benefits. One more question just popped in. Any thoughts on the value of alignment outside of school-based pre-K? For instance, should we be looking at policy levers like publicly funded incentives for private pre-K to invest in aligning with public schools? Yes, that is an excellent point. It's a point I probably should make. I feel like when I talk about this topic, I'm often like, oh, it should all pre-K should be in public schools. That is not going to happen. It is not, first of all, it's not possible. And one of the schools in my study, actually, in a subsequent year, the pre-K program got pushed out because enrollment was growing and they didn't have room for kindergarten. We're not going to move to a place where all pre-K programs are in elementary schools. There's also a lot of value in having a mixed delivery system of early childhood education. It provides parents with choice to do what works best for them. And there's a lot in having, if you have an infant, for example, and a 4-year-old, it makes it easier on parents to send them to a center that can house both of them. And so so I just want to make that point that like we are always going to be in a mixed delivery system. We're always going to have center-based care. And so as a result, we should be thinking about how we can facilitate alignment between those centers as well. And I think there's a variety of ways you can do it. It's certainly more difficult. It's something that's being recognized in policy. The most recent evaluation of ESEA stipulates that all local education authorities or agencies, I don't even know what LEA the A stands for, but all LEAs have to have a memorandum of understanding with Head Start programs in the district I think a lot of those are perfunctory and don't have a lot of teeth, but at least it signals that people are starting to think about this. And, you know, I think the idea of financial incentives is really interesting because we also need to shore up the kind of childcare sector before we can ask them to engage in this work. I mean, childcare centers are often operating at the margins and are really not in a financially secure position. And so asking these administrators to go above and beyond and go to meetings at elementary schools and at the district office, you know, we're going to need to better resource that sector, I think, before we start asking them to do this work. But I do think that they really need to, we need a whole nother area that I don't focus on, but it's certainly, I agree, something we need to think about is how we engage with these centers.
Michael, I know North Carolina is one of the states that people talk about when they talk about, you know, having a really nice, robust statewide longitudinal data system. I'm just curious if you have any plan. First of all, I don't actually know if pre-K is part of that. So is that true? And then if so, do you have any plans to look at your work there? I know you mentioned that you had qualitative stuff going on or did qualitative stuff, but thinking about the quantitative angle.
Well, it's a funny point. Well, it's a little bit of a sore subject for me. My intention with my dissertation was actually to have the quantitative data come from North Carolina and have that concordance between the two. Our state is known for having great data. They've been working on building an ECIDS, an integrated data system that brought all of our early childhood, not just NC Pre-K, Head Start, TANF, WIC, like all these early childhood benefits all together with a unique child identifier. But we had some folks in our legislature concerned about it was built and ready, and some folks concerned about privacy, and it is currently kind of in limbo. And so right now you can look at NC Pre-K data, and I can look at the kids, the demographics, all that, and I can look at K-12. The unique identifiers are scrambled and not linkable right now. There are some folks at Duke, the Center for Child and Family Policy. Robert Carr, for example, is working on with Ken Dodge to link those data manually and based on name, you know, a lot of different things that might make them seem like they're the same kid in administrative data. So there are some efforts to build that. I try to keep a regular call with him so that we can hopefully work with those data in the future, but unfortunately it's not linkable right now. One state that does link, when I was at AIR, I did a project with Rail Southwest. Oklahoma has their data connected, but unfortunately it's not quite ready here in North Carolina, but hopefully soon.
All right, we have time for one more question if someone has one.
I mean, if I'll throw one more out. So I'm curious about what you found when you were looking at the school-based pre-K programs. One of the comments the principal made, I think, was interesting to me. Do those typically serve as a pretty stable feeder pattern, if you will, into the actual school that houses them?
Yeah, it can vary state by state. In the ECLSK, the nationally representative data, it was about 50% of kids. So about 50%. So I didn't delve into this because the results were null no matter what, but
sure.
I did a subsequent analysis where I looked at differences between those that attended in an elementary school and went somewhere else, and those that attended and stayed in the same school. The proportion of kids that stayed in the same school is about 50%. So it's
Okay.
not terribly high. And so I think that that might be another reason why there's a disconnect, because you're not building those relationships and the kids are going somewhere else and they have to learn new teachers and new hallways and new everything. So and that gets to that point in the framework. That last element was continuity and pathways. And so getting districts and getting the assignment right to try to get people in a pathway where they'd stay in the same school, I think is another area that a pretty low cost, easy thing that districts could do to try to improve this.
I bet on your qualitative side, some perspectives from parents could have really spoken to that point too, because that's where it's not just getting the students oriented to those spaces and processes, but getting the families in there. So that's intriguing.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that whenever I do data collection again in the future, it'll definitely include parents.
Well, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Michael, for giving us so much of your time and very interesting topic, had us all very engaged. So that wraps up our semester of Policy Brown Bag Talks. Michael, you really set us out with a bang, so I appreciate that. This recording will be available on our YouTube channel. I'll post it on Twitter, all sorts of things. But thank you all for coming, and thanks again, Michael.
Thank you all so much.